churches of a dozen
Yeah.
that do what we did last week.
Yeah.
You know,
Good morning.
We should have much contact. I got a few other things I gotta bounce on.
hey, get my contact, Bruce, before we. Yeah. What's up, bro? Good to see you.
Well, you all came back. Must have been something Lucas said. Now, wasn't last week one of the best we've ever had? And Lucas has agreed. I'm surprised he hasn't done it by now. But he's agreed to type all that up.
That's correct.
And email it to me, and I'm gonna send it all out to you guys. Right?
Hey, Dave.
What do you,
Dave.
go like this? Huh?
I have it if you want.
No, I don't want you to feel bad. I think I'd rather get it from him.
Mhm.
Right?
Yep.
Okay.
Average age just came down 25 years.
What did?
The average age. No, we got one other guy here just dropped it back about 25 years.
That's my grandson.
Is that real?
Yeah, that's Sam.
Hey, Sam.
How old are you?
Sam, how old are you?
That's nice.
Is that what you meant?
Yeah, Sam, what do you do for work, brother? What do you do for work? Oh, and where? Okay, nice. And he hustled you to come? Yeah. You know,
Oh.
hey, look around. It's every other dude in this room. Every other guy in this room. He hustled them to come too. So don't worry about it, man. You're in good company. Yeah.
I think we better pray.
Let's do it.
Father, I come to you again today and just, Lord, I stand in awe of what you have done for each and every one of us and how you guide our life. And how you set circumstances in front of us. Some we take, some we don't. And Lord, someday we're gonna see everything that you have done for us that we do not realize that you're doing on an hourly and on a daily basis. And I thank you for that. And I just pray that each man here will open their heart today to Lucas and your word as he delivers it to us. And I ask these things in Jesus' name. Amen.
Good morning. A couple of reminders. We committed ourselves this year to be three things. What are those three things? Anybody remember? Tell me. Yeah, biblical is number one. That's right. We just read through the Bible and teach through the Bible. We're not doing a book or anything. It's okay for people to go through books and different things, but here we read and teach through the Bible. Number two is what? Transformational. We're not going to be like a man that looks at himself in a mirror and immediately goes away and forgets what he looks like. When James says that in the book of James, that's funny to James. He thinks that's a funny thing to say. That's first century Hebrew humor for you. But that's a joke for him. We should laugh at a man who looks himself in a mirror and immediately goes away and forgets what he looks like. We're going to allow the Bible to shape us and transform us. And the final thing is what? Invitational. The hope is that you're inviting somebody along with you, somebody in your workplace, service provider, friend, somebody you know from church, whatever, to come if this is a place where you think they would feel comfortable and engaged. So that's what we're doing. We're teaching through the book of John at an absolute snail's pace. It's been great. I committed myself. I told Doug this morning, I committed myself to getting through the end of chapter 12 today. We're going to get through one verse. So, and I'm not kidding, one verse. That's all we're getting through. So I totally broke my commitment. So let's remember where we've come from the last couple of weeks, because it is important for context. Oh, not John chapter 12, John chapter 8. We're in John chapter 8. So what we did last week, if you remember, is we fast forwarded and we hung out in John chapter 12 for a little while, because this incident happened 6 days before Passover, 6 days before, or 5 days before Jesus entered in Jerusalem on a donkey, crowd shouting Hosanna, throwing their coats on the road. The next day he's crucified. And so in the midst of the Easter season, what we wanted to look at was this act of worship and devotion, friendship, gratitude that Jesus' friend Mary does at Simon the leper's house with disciples sitting around a table. So we're going to go back to where we were. And remember in John chapter 7, Jesus is at a feast in Jerusalem called the Feast of what? Remember? Booths, right? So, or Feast of Tabernacles. That's right. And Booths, tabernacles, Feast of Tents, you could call it. And it's a feast. It's the most popular feast in all of the Jewish calendar, Josephus says, the Jewish historian. And so more people would have been in Jerusalem than any other time of the year. It's an interesting notion, because if all Jews were required, all male Jews were required to go to Jerusalem for these 4 feasts in a year, why? I asked myself, why is that one more popular? Here's what I think, Howard. Here's what I think. I think because it was a party, it drew a bunch of Gentiles too. That's what I think, because it was the harvest festival where they celebrated olives that they had harvested, celebrated the grapes that they had harvested, that they turned into something else, right? And so everybody comes out, they camp out in Jerusalem, live in these temporary dwellings, tabernacles, booths, tents, whatever that you want to call them. And it's in memoriam of this time where the nation of Israel has been enslaved in Egypt for over 400 years. God sends a redeemer named Moses. Moses comes in, says, let my people go. Pharaoh is underwhelmed by that possibility because he doesn't want to lose his free labor force. And so God has to do some convincing through some plagues. Eventually, he lets those people go. And from the time that they leave the nation of Egypt as slaves and before they enter into the promised land over a 40-year time period, they're living in temporary dwellings. They're nomads. So God prescribes this feast of temporary dwellings to say, look back at this moment where you're living in temporary dwellings. And so we talked about this moment where, again, Jesus stands up and says, if anyone is thirsty, let him what? Come to me. And from him will flow streams of living water. But recall, because this is where we're going to go this morning in John chapter 8, recall that the context here is mission critical. Remember, for those of you guys that weren't here, what happens is that during this Feast of Weeks, so the Feast of Weeks, or I keep saying Feast of Weeks, Feast of Booths is 8 days long. It's bookended by 2 Sabbath days. So it's bookended by 2 no work days, and there's 6 days in the middle of this feast. And every day of this feast, what would happen is one of the priests would leave the city proper, go down to the pool of Siloam, and draw up with a golden chalice a bit of water, and come up to this altar near the eastern gate. I have to do it in my head. The eastern gate of the temple, and pour water out. And remember, he would say to everybody before he poured water out, let me see your hands. And everybody would go like this, because what had happened in the past, this is not in the Bible, but this is in Jewish history, was one of those priests was about to pour this water out in the ceremony, and he accidentally dropped the water, and everybody threw lemons at him, or something the equivalent of lemons in first century Palestine. So he says, let me see your hands. And everybody goes like this. We don't have any lemons in our hand, just in case you spill the water. I think that's hilarious. Apparently you don't. That's fine. So he pours this water out, and the water once again represents for the nation of Israel this memorial how God had provided, right? How God provided water from a rock, how God had provided for them during this time of 40 years of wandering in the between slavery and the promised land, how God had provided so many things. And immediately following this pouring out of water in this most important moment of the feast, John says in chapter 8, on the last and greatest day of the feast, the last and greatest day, the celebratory day, the big day, everybody's waving palm branches. They got this citrus fruit in their other hand, and they're going crazy, and they pour this water out, and everybody celebrates. And then the Jewish history says it goes so silent. The Bible doesn't say this, but Jewish history tells us that after the pouring out of water, everybody just knew we're just going to go silent. And Jewish history says they were so quiet they could hear the breeze in the palm trees. So quiet. On the last and greatest day, and Jesus stands up and he says, if anyone is thirsty, let him come to me, and out of him will flow streams of living water. Now, the religious leaders know precisely what Jesus is doing. He's making some wild claims here. So they say, we're going to kill you. The other person that they will eventually try to kill is this man named Lazarus, right? That he raises from the dead just a few chapters later, because he's a walking, talking evidence of Jesus' power over death. So they say they're going to kill him. And then a man named Nicodemus stands up, who is a religious leader, part of the Sanhedrin, part of this ruling group of Jews, says, don't we give a man due process? We don't lynch people. We give them the opportunity to go on trial. His fellow Pharisees say to him, are you one of Jesus' followers too? And Nicodemus kind of gets off at that point, but eventually Nicodemus would be one of two that bury Jesus. This is the Nicodemus from chapter 3. Okay, so that's where we're at, and I want you to pick it up in John chapter 8, verse 1. This is not where we're going to be this morning, but I want you to see it again because we did this just a couple weeks ago. John chapter 8, verse 1. So this is just after Jesus says, if anyone comes to me, let him, if anyone is thirsty, let him come to me. Out of him will flow streams of living water. Jews say, we're going to kill you. Nicodemus says we should give him due process. Jesus kind of gets his way out of that situation. Verse 1, but Jesus went to the Mount of Olives. Early in the morning, he came again to the temple. Wait a minute. He went outside the city to the Mount of Olives and then right back into the temple. And all the people came to him and he sat down and taught them. The scribes and the Pharisees brought a woman who had been caught in adultery, and placing her in the midst, they said to him, teacher, this woman has been caught in the act of adultery. Everybody look up at me. Do we remember reviewing this text? Do you remember looking through and saying there are 13 Greek words in here that don't appear anywhere else in the book of John? Do you remember saying that it does not appear in the earliest manuscripts? And do you remember when I said it doesn't fit in the text? Remember we talked about that? Are we now reading it going, what the heck just happened here? Here he is in the midst of this festival. He goes to the Mount of Olives and right back in. This seems weird. So this is the portion that probably happened. I believe it happened, but it doesn't belong here. And John didn't write that. Okay. So we're going to pick it up in verse 12. Don't read it yet because that's the only verse we're reviewing today. So we are going to do a little bit more conversation like we did last week. That was really fun. We're going to do that, but I want to set up the context here because the context is really important. During the Feast of Booths, there was a secondary portion of this festival that was really, really important. And not secondary in terms of priority, but secondary in terms of it happened late in the day. So what happened every night of the Feast of Booths, from the first night to the last night, when the sun went down, the minute that there was darkness, everyone would gather in the temple. And they would gather in a place called the Court of the Women. So the temple, just so you know, think of the temple as like a babushka. You know those little Russian dolls you keep opening up, opening them up? Okay. The outside court in the court of, or in the temple is called the Court of the Gentiles. That doesn't mean only Gentiles were allowed there. That means that that's as far as Gentiles could go. Non-Jews. That's the external court. Okay. Everybody could go in there. That's the place where the money changers would have been when Jesus turned over the tables of the money changers, because when people came from all over the Roman world, they had to exchange money. That's where that would have happened. There were signs out on the outside, or not on the outside of that court, but just on the inside of the Court of Gentiles as you're about to pass into the next court. And those signs say, do not enter unless you're allowed. And if you enter and you are not allowed, it's on penalty of death, right? What's the pirate, you who come here or whatever, we're going to behead you or something. I don't know, whatever, like enter here on penalty of death. The next court is called the Court of the Women. It doesn't mean only women allowed in there. That just means that's as far as women could go. In this particular court, there were anybody who was not Gentile, women included, could go in there. So Jewish people. Inside that court was the temple treasury. It's where people would pay their temple tax. It was where they would collect an offering. When the widow puts her 2 mites, you know the story of the widow and the 2 mites, that happens in the Court of the Women. Okay. The next court is called the court of the Israelites. So if you're an Israelite male, Jewish male, you could get in there. The next court is the court of the priests. Do you see the babushka? Okay. And on every single court, do not enter upon penalty of death. In the court of the priests, only priests could go in. Inside of that court was a place called the holy place. Tracking with me? And then inside of that was the most holy place. So in the court of the women, the only folks that could not go in here were Gentiles. So all the Jews who were in Jerusalem for the Feast of Booths would come into the court of the women where there was the temple treasury. And during the Feast of Booths, now catch this, I love it. They put up for the entire feast 4 candelabras. Those golden candelabras were 75 feet high. Tracking with me? Okay, picture this. On the top of those 4 golden candelabras, there were 4 bowls. Each of those bowls were 10 gallons apiece. And they would send, at the beginning of this lighting ceremony that they would do every night when it got dark, they would send, I was telling my wife this last night. She's like, is there a spiritual significance of that? I'm like, no, they're just smart, okay? They would send the young men. And she's like, how did they get up there? Ladders. This is seriously. They got up by ladders. They sent the young men up because if they fell, maybe they survive. They sent the young men up. They would fill these bowls with 10 gallons of oil. They would use old tears of priestly garments as wicks. So priestly garments that have been old and worn out, they would use them as wicks, and they would light these 4 golden candelabras. Now remember, Jerusalem is set up on a hill, and it was said that you could see Jerusalem from miles around when they lit these 4 golden candelabras in the court of women. So I want to give you just a little bit more information about this lighting ceremony because I think it's really extraordinary. So again, it's the end of the first day. It's in the court of women. It's the second court where the treasury is held. And they would send young men up with priestly garments, 10 gallons of oil. And the Levitical musicians would play their harps, lyres, cymbals, trumpets, and just make joyful music unto the Lord when they lit these golden candelabras. So in order to light the candles, young men would have to climb several ladders to reach the wicks that were made from old priestly garments. The Talmud states that at the base of the candles, there's a quote from the Talmud, men of piety and good deeds would dance with lighted torches in their hands, singing songs of praises. Levites without number, with harps, lyres, cymbals, and trumpets and other musical instruments, were there upon the 15 steps leading down from the court of the Gentiles into the court of the women. And they would just throw an absolute crazy party. So here's what happens. They do this final ceremony of water on the last and greatest day of the feast. Everything goes dead silent, so quiet you can hear the breeze through the trees. And Jesus says, if anyone is thirsty, he stands up. Could you imagine that? My wife was saying last night, don't you think he was afraid? Probably. I can imagine Jesus stand up and go, if anyone would come up, if anyone is thirsty, I'm sure he was not thrilled, right? I mean, like that's got to be a heart, not afraid in his flesh, but just like, gosh, this is not easy. Right? So he says, if anyone will come after me, or if anyone is thirsty, let him come after me. And from him will flow streams of living water. And then they walk to the court of the women. Remember this feast. It's really important that you know that in Leviticus 23, when God prescribes this feast, he reminds them, and this happens in the Feast of Booths, it happens in the Feast of Weeks, to make sure that in that feast you care for the widow, the sojourner, the foreigner among you. So they walk to the court of the women. There is a lighting ceremony of 4 75-foot high candelabras, each with 10 gallons of oil. And in John chapter 8, verse 12, this is the only verse we're doing today. Ready? Again, Jesus spoke to them. I am the light of the world. Whoever follows me will not walk in darkness, but will have the light of life. Now, we're going to unpack that just a little bit, but I'm going to read it one more time. And I want you to close your eyes if you would. I know it may be silly. I know it may feel strange. The Bible says on the last and greatest day of the feast, the most important moment, this priest pours out water that represents God's provision and God's presence and God's refreshing grace to the nation of Israel. The whole crowd goes quiet. Jesus stands up and says, if anyone thirsts, let him come to me, and from him will flow streams of living water. And then that crowd begins to make their way from the northeastern side of the city of Jerusalem into the court of Gentiles. From the court of Gentiles, they passed through a gate called Beautiful. It was an enormous, ornate gate into the court of the women. Young men climbed up 75 feet of ladders and filled 4 golden bowls on top of 4 70-foot high, 70-foot tall candelabras, and lit those bowls. And the city of Jerusalem was visible from miles around. You talk about a fire hazard. And Jesus says, I am the light of the world. If anyone follows me, he will not walk in darkness, but he will have the light of life. Now look up at me. Does it feel a little different now hearing that than if you just read it, Jesus saying, I am the light of the world? One of the things I was telling my wife last night, I want to be very, very careful in here that we don't get, remember we talked about being transformational, that we don't get caught up in the cultural and the linguistic and the historical. I was talking to Doug about that this morning too, that we are allowing this to transform our hearts. But for me, getting into that piece and seeing it for what it is and trying to picture myself in that moment and being afraid for my friend that just climbed 75-foot ladders and smelling the oil burning and hearing these Levitical priests that are musicians in the temple just going bananas on the last day of the feast. This is our last night to celebrate and party and thank God for his provision. And these, can you hear the fire? Like, oh, right? And Jesus says, that's me. That's me. I'm the light of the world. And whoever follows me never walk in darkness, but he will have the light of life. Does it feel different? It does to me. Okay. Now, we could discuss, pontificate, guess, or conjecture what it means that Jesus is the light of the world. We said this before. It cannot mean for us now what it did not mean for them then. Let me say that again. It cannot mean for us now what it did not mean for them then. What that means is when we discern and discover what Jesus means when he says, I am the light of the world, we have to see it through a first century Hebrew mindset. Are you tracking with me? We cannot superimpose a 21st century modern Western view over the top, 2,100 years old, right? We can't superimpose it over the top and say, you know, today when you shine a flashlight into a room, everybody who's listening to this has no idea what a flashlight is, right? The Romans hadn't invented flashlights yet. That's a joke, Doug. You're like that. So we have to see it through a first century Hebrew mindset. Are you tracking with me? Does that make sense? In order to discover and discern what it is that Jesus means. So this is question number 1, and we're looking for full participation here. When you think of the Old Testament and the role of light, where do you see light show up? Doug's nodding. He understands where my question. Where are the places in the Old Testament where you see light show up and play a part? Genesis. What happens in Genesis? In the beginning was, in the beginning, I was going to say was the word. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth was void and without form, and the Spirit of God hovered over the surface of the deep. The very first thing that God does is he says, let there be light, and there was what? So what does that light represent for the nation of Israel, for the Hebrew mindset? What is that very first light in Genesis 1? What does it represent and mean for them? God's creative power. Let's just jot that one down if you're tracking. God's creative power. So when these candelabras are lit in the temple, for them, it very much represents God's creative power. Where else do we see light show up? Ooh, Doug. So if this is a feast of booths to commemorate this moment where the nation of Israel left slavery in Egypt, they're moving toward the promised land. This is the very first time in that moment that we see the pillar of fire by night and the pillar of smoke by day show up. Are you tracking with me? Do you remember? Somebody do me a favor and turn to Exodus 14, verse 19. I just want you to read Exodus 14, 19, and 20. Matt, while he's doing that, would you get Psalm 18:2, please? Okay, Exodus 14, 19, and 20. Who's got that? Not everybody at once. Raise your hand. Who's got it? You got to read it out loud. Come on, are you literate? Thank you, Doug, for crying out loud. This is pulling teeth this morning. Doug, Exodus 14, 19, and 20. I promise I won't make fun of you anymore. Go.
Then the angel of God who was going before the host of Israel moved behind them. A pillar of cloud moved from before them and stood coming between the host of Egypt and the host of Israel. Then there was cloud in the darkness, lit up the night without one coming near other.
The nation of Israel's left Egypt. They're running to the Red Sea. They get to the Red Sea. Pharaoh's army is collapsing behind them. And read it again very loud and very slowly, Doug. What happens? Listen, nation of Israel's at the Red Sea. Tracking, you know the context? The nation of Israel, the nation of Egypt coming for them. And here's what happens. Read it.
The angel of God who was going before the host of Israel, a pillar of cloud moved before them, stood behind them, coming between the host of Egypt and cloud in the darkness, lit up the night without one coming other.
God's protection. Everybody write it down. Did you hear it? The very first time we see a pillar of fire show up, and we remember it, right? For those of you who know the story, we remember it as they, if the pillar of cloud got up and moved, we get up and move. Pillar of fire got up and move, we get up and move. But the very first time we see it show up, this is God's protective power manifested by his light for his people. Matt, read it out loud. Psalm 18:2. Read it loud and proud, Matt.
The Lord is my rock and my deliverer, my rock.
That's right. That's right. So for the nation of Israel, it represents God's protection. Psalm 18:2, if you're looking for a reference. That this shows up all over the Old Testament, God's protective power manifested by his light. So we have God's creative power, we have his protective power. What else happens, or what other important roles does light play in the Old Testament? So for the Hebrew mindset, hit it. Go ahead. Hold it. I love it. Hold it.
The word is a lamp to my feet, a light to my.
Right. So what is happening there? What does light represent there? Guidance. Okay. God's guidance. Your word is a lamp into my feet and a light into my path. I love that it's not like a big high beam, right? The people tell me all the time, like, no, I just want to know what God's doing in my life. You do know what God's doing in your life. He's given you step 1. Don't think he's going to give you step 9 until you take step 1. It's a lamp into your feet. You get the next step. Okay. So once that protective power shows up as light between the nation of Israel and the nation of Egypt, they end up crossing the Red Sea, right? And somebody give me Exodus 13, verses 21 and 22. Exodus 13, verses 21 and 22. Raise your hand real quick if you got it. Go for it, Cole. Read it real loud.
Apple by day, by night. Pillar of cloud by day, by night.
So what's happening? Pillar of cloud and pillar of light and pillar of fire show up to do what? To guide them. This is Psalm 119, 105. Your word is a lamp unto my feet and a light unto my path. So we have God's creative power. We got his protective power. We've got God's guidance showing up. And anytime that pillar of cloud or that pillar of fire moved, they would go. Okay? These are the things that it very much represents for every single Hebrew mind and heart listening when Jesus says, I'm the light of the world. I got a couple more. What else? What else in the Old Testament? Okay. Okay, that word, 100%, that's the word, Matt. That word does not show up in the Old Testament, by the way. Shekinah glory shows up in other Hebrew texts. Okay, after Moses comes down from the mountain, Howard said eminence. Eventually, what you would have is God saying, I want you to build a tabernacle, not a bunch of tabernacles, but a single tabernacle. And in that tabernacle is the place where I will dwell. And God's presence showed up by way of a light. That's the Shekinah glory of God. So we're talking about God's presence. Somebody read Exodus 40, 34 through 38. Exodus 40, 34 through 38. Scott, would you do me a favor and get Psalm 145, 11 through 30, or Psalm 145, 18 and 19, please. Psalm 145, 18 and 19, and just hang on to it. Who's got Exodus 40, 34 through 38? Read it loud and proud.
Moses was unable to enter the tent of meeting because the cloud had settled on it. The glory of the Lord filled the tabernacle. Throughout all their journey, the cloud was taken up from over the tabernacle. The sons of Israel would set out. But if the cloud was not taken up, then they would not set out until the day when it was taken up. Throughout all their journeys, the cloud of the Lord was on the tabernacle by day, and there was fire in it by night. Of all of the house of Israel.
Did you hear it? Did you hear it? So it's guidance, but it's also God's presence. Okay. Scott, hit it real loud.
45, 18 through 19.
That's correct.
The Lord is near to all who call on him.
Stop. The Lord is what? Near. Keep going.
All call on him. He fulfills the desire of those who fear him. He also hears their cry and saves them.
Tracking the nearness of God. Okay. Evidenced, manifested by a light. That's Psalm 145, 18 and 19. Okay, so let's go back. Oh, go ahead, Howard. Correct.
Zechariah, the high priest of all priests, was the only one that was able to go in. They used to tie a rope around their ankle to make sure if they disrespected God, God would kill them. Anybody that walked into the Holy of Holies without God's allowance would be killed, would die.
Do hard research on that. See if it's really true. Do hard research on it. Don't take a preacher's word for it. Okay, the four things that we've established. What are the four things in the Old Testament represented by light? What are they? God's what? We started Genesis 1. God's what? Power. And the first time that pillar of cloud and pillar of fire, smoke, pillar of fire at night show up for the nation of Israel, what is God doing? Protection. And then when that pillar of cloud and pillar of smoke and pillar of fire move, what is God doing? Guiding. And then when the pillar of fire shows up in the tabernacle, what is God doing? Presence. He's saying, I'm imminent. I'm near to you, right? This is the last one, and it would be very, very challenging to get. So I'm just going to read it for you, okay? Don't turn there. Don't turn there. I just want you to listen. Do you guys remember when we talked about how Old Testament prophecies have what's called a double fulfillment? when Old Testament prophecies are spoken out or written down, there's kind of this immediate place where they're fulfilled. And then also there could be a second kind of layer or third layer of fulfillment that happens. So it's kind of this immediate thing, but it's also this eschatological coming in the future thing. So it's as if you see a mountain from afar away and you go, there's a mountain, I got it. But then the closer you get to the mountain, you start to see the flora and the fauna and the animal kingdom and that kind of thing that you wouldn't have seen way back here. Old Testament prophecies have kind of a double fulfillment. Okay, so I'm going to read you Zechariah 14. This has got a double fulfillment. It's got a couple of layers to it, but here, I want you to think future layer. Okay, future layer. Just listen. Tell me what you think Zechariah is talking about. Behold, a day is coming for the Lord when the spoil taken from you will be divided in your midst. I will gather all the nations against Jerusalem to battle, and the city shall be taken, and the houses plundered, and the women raped. Half the city shall go out into exile, but the rest of the people shall not be cut off from the city. Then the Lord will go out and fight against those nations as when he fights on a day of battle. On that day, his feet shall stand on the Mount of Olives that lies before Jerusalem on the east, and the Mount of Olives shall be split in two from east to west in a very wide valley, so that one half of the mount shall move northward, and the other half shall move southward. And you shall flee to the valley of the mountains, and the valley of the mountains shall reach to Azal, and you shall flee as you fled from the earthquake in the days of Uzziah, king of Judah. Then the Lord my God will come, and all the holy ones with him. What's it sound like so far? Yeah, it's second coming. Sounds like apocalyptic, right? Okay, now listen. Verse 6. On that day there shall be no light, cold or frost, and there shall be a unique day which is known to the Lord, neither day or night, but at evening time there shall be light. On that day living water shall flow out from Jerusalem. Did you just hear it? Did you just hear it? Not complicated. Living water shall flow out from Jerusalem, half of them to the eastern sea and half of them to the western sea, and it shall continue in summer as in winter. And the Lord will be king over all the earth, and on that day the Lord will be one, and his name one. The whole land shall be turned into a plain from Geba to Ramon, south of Jerusalem. But Jerusalem shall remain aloft in its sight, from the gate of Benjamin to the place of the former gate to the corner gate, and from the tower of Hananel to the king's wine presses. And it shall be inhabited, for there shall never again be a decree of utter destruction. Jerusalem shall dwell in security. And this shall be the plague with which the Lord will strike all the peoples that wage war against Jerusalem. Their flesh will rot while they are standing on their feet, and their eyes will rot in their sockets, and their tongues will rot in their mouths. Yeek. Let's pray. No, I'm kidding. It's apocalyptic, right? It's apocalyptic. It's future coming. It's future kingdom. This notion of light for the nation of Israel began to represent the future kingdom of the Messiah. Matt.
It says in Revelation how there won't be any sun because
Correct.
the glory of God is the light of the New Jerusalem.
Correct.
And so it's like Jesus embodies all of that. Jesus is the light, and his glory is just shining in.
Stand up and turn around and say it for everybody to hear, Matt. I'm not kidding. Stand up and turn around and say it. Are you just all we're doing is connecting dots? That's all we're doing. Say it again, Matt.
Okay. So I'm not as I get a little.
Just say it, Matt. You're doing great.
Book of Revelation, John, or Jesus' revelation to John and Adam of Patmos. He says that there will be no sun or moon, just only God's light, which is the glory of God shining, and that will light the New Jerusalem.
You tracking? Are we tracking? Thank you, Matt. Are you connecting the dots? Can I read I stopped in Zechariah. Can I read the very next verse? You ready? This is the very next verse. Then everyone who survives of all the nations have come up against Jerusalem shall go up year after year to worship the King, the Lord of hosts, and to keep the Feast of Booths. And if any of the families of the earth do not go up to Jerusalem to worship the King, the Lord of hosts, there will be no rain on them. And if the family of Egypt does not go up and present themselves, then on them there shall be no rain. There shall be the plague with which the Lord afflicts the nations that do not go up to keep the what? Feast of Booths. Verse 19, this shall be the punishment to Egypt and the punishment to all the nations that do not go up to keep the, not a trick question, Feast of Booths.
How many years prior was that?
700, Doug? Come on, channel your inner Howard Hendricks. Doug got an 723 about, yeah, Doug got an MDiv from a reputable organization. I did not. Is that, somebody said staggering. Is that not wild to you? So here we have this moment where Jesus appropriates these Old Testament themes. Do you remember the shapes we talk about? The shape of the prophet, the shape of the tabernacle, the shape of the temple. We don't know what the Messiah is until he says, unless we have shapes. God gave us a tabernacle. God gave us a temple. God gave us a prophet. God gave us vines in the Old Testament. God gave us these shapes, these kind of understandings, these concepts. And then Jesus shows up on the scene. And he says, I am the true vine. Oh, okay. I know what that. Okay. Tear down this temple and I'll rebuild it in 3 days. Right? He starts to step into these shapes. He says, one who is greater than Moses is here among you. You know the shape of a redeemer because of Moses, but now I have stepped into that. And so now you can see who I am. In the very same way, Jesus is saying, I am the light of the world. I am the embodiment of God's what? Say our 5 things that we just talked about. His creative power, his protection, his guidance, his presence, and his future kingdom is the last one. Jesus says, I am the light of the world. And then he makes a promise. He said, whoever follows me. I like this word follows because in the New Testament, this is a very, very, very technical term. The way we use it now is like, someone kind of follows along behind, or, you follow a teacher, which is fine. Or, if I was walking out of school yesterday, I told my son, Canaan, follow me. That's more general. I mean, it's a command, but here in the New Testament, it's a technical term. And really the technical term is apprenticeship. I want to be an electrician, so I follow an electrician around all the time and do what they do, and they teach me how to do that. For the first century Hebrew mind, that word would have been what? Disciple. It's a very technical term. Okay, William Barclay is a commentator, a Bible scholar, and he reviews a couple of places that the word follow is used in the New Testament and is used kind of within the New Testament world, just to help us get a more robust understanding. So I want to quote Barclay. I'm going to paraphrase Barclay here. I'm not going to quote him. I'm paraphrasing, but this is not mine. This is Barclay's. So it's often used as a soldier following his captain. No matter where that captain goes, I go in behind. Okay. It's often used as a servant accompanying his master. I am here to help. I'm here to serve. I'm here to do what you want. I deliberately don't use the word slave for 2 reasons. 1, I got black kids. Number 2, our modern understanding of slavery because of American slavery is not the same as the Roman world. Those are not synonyms. So this is a servant following his master. Number 3, it's often used of accepting a wise counselor's opinion. I follow their instructions. Tracking? Okay. It's often used as giving obedience to the laws of a city or a state. And it's often used as following a teacher's line of argument. Like someone says, do you follow? You say, I follow. I'm tracking with you. Howard, go ahead.
Well, also back in the Jewish war with Sadducees and Pharisees, in order to become a rabbi, you would, from a young age, follow them their entire day. And you would sleep at their bedside. If they invited you to learn from them, then you would become part of the Sadducees and the Pharisees. So it was a lifelong learning experience to be accepted into that culture.
Yeah. So it's so critical what Howard said. One of the things is if they invited you, so as an apprentice, as a disciple, you don't invite yourself. This is why Jesus has to come along to his disciples and say to do what? Follow me. That's his invitation. They don't get to say, can I follow you? May I be your apprentice? That's not how that works. It's the other way around. They had aged out by that point. Remember, they were not at the time where they would get an invitation at 12 years old to come be a disciple or an apprentice. They had aged out and they had got their own jobs as a tax collector or as a fisherman or whatever. So this invitation would have been the honor and the surprise of their life. And they would have followed Jesus like a soldier following his captain, like a servant following a master, like a wise counselor, or like accepting a wise counselor's opinion. Giving obedience to the laws of Jesus and following a teacher's line of argument. And I quote, this is Barclay, to be a follower of Christ is to give oneself body, soul, and spirit into the obedience of the master. And to enter upon that following is to walk in the light. When we walk alone, we are bound to stumble and grope, for so many of life's problems are beyond our solution. When we walk alone, we're bound to take the wrong way because we have no secure map of life. We need the heavenly wisdom to walk the earthly way. The man who has a sure guide and an accurate map is the man who is bound to come up in safety to his journey's end. Jesus Christ is that guide. He alone possesses the map to life. To follow him is to walk in safety through life and afterward to enter into glory, end quote. Jesus would say it this way, or John would say it this way: in him was life, and that life was the light of men. Go ahead.
Well, to say the overriding thing, spiritual, follow me, with all of the spirit, and then all the other stuff.
I think to some extent, I mean, so one of the things that we did at the church that I was that I led in Toronto, one of the things we worked really hard to do was to define disciple. Because, people say all the time, like our church, our goal is to make disciples. So if you're like the goal of your organization is to make paperweights, you should have a definition of what a paperweight is, right? Or Cole works for an organization that does wealth management. They have definitions of success, metrics that say this is how we know we accomplished our goal. You don't just go out there and go, I think we're doing pretty good. People don't like that with their money, by the way. I think we're doing okay. It's like, I'm going to find alternate investments, an alternate representative. So one of the things that we worked really hard on was a definition of discipleship, because if that's the widget you're making, you should be able to define that widget. So here was the definition of discipleship or follower for us. A disciple is an individual who is systematically reorganizing their life in order to reflect the character and priorities of Jesus. I do believe it is intrinsically spiritual and at the core. And at the same time, the Bible is not necessarily, Doug and I were talking about this, a list of spiritual platitudes. This is not Confucius, right? This is an actual walking, talking, a breathing human being that was lynched, resurrected from the dead on the third day, and has now given us his spirit in John chapter 14 as a what? Guide. Do you see the link? Oh, let's just do it there. God's protection. So God's protection shows up on the scene. Somebody give me Ephesians 1, chapter 1, verse 13. Ephesians 1, verse 13. Listen to what Paul will say about the Spirit of God. Gus, do you have it? Read it aloud. You were what with the promise? Sealed. Do you see the protection? Do you see it? The Spirit does the same thing. In John chapter 14, the Spirit shows up as a guide. It's all of these things. These are the shapes now that the Spirit is stepping into. Back to following. Sorry, I got off on a tangent for a minute there. Back to following. Jesus says, if you follow me, I promise, I am the light of the world. I am the guide, the protection, the creative power. I'm the embodiment of those things, all that stuff. If you follow me, turn yourself over mind, body, and spirit, that you systematically reorganize your life in order to reflect the character and priorities of Jesus, there are two things I will promise. Number one, you will not walk in darkness, is the second half of that verse. Did you see it? John 8, verse 12. Jesus says, I'm the light of the world. Whoever follows me will not walk in darkness. Here's what I love about that. What I love about that is that the nature of the Jesus way and the nature of these kingdom principles that he unfolds is that they bring illumination and clarity to life's most complicated and difficult issues. I'm going to say that one more time. The nature of Jesus and his life and his kingdom principles that he unfolds is that they bring illumination and clarity to life's most difficult issues. So when we follow Jesus as the light of the world, we will not walk in darkness, but he will bring clarity and illumination to life's most difficult issues. Let me give you an example. Centuries old, as old as dirt problem. Why is there evil in the world, right? Why is there pain in the world? The core tenets of Christianity explain and bring clarity to that question. It may not be your favorite answer, but they at least bring clarity. You look at other faith systems, you look at atheism, and you look at some of those other kind of worldviews and viewpoints. They have a very, very difficult time explaining why there's pain and difficulty and evil in the world. Christianity has no problem explaining that. Why is there pain and evil and difficulty in the world? Sin. Move on. Other faith systems, especially atheism, have a very, very difficult time explaining why there is a walking, talking creature called Luke or called Howard or called Dave that has an eye that has like a complicated system of mirrors inside of it, right? Or, 30 feet or whatever of small intestine, or just go beyond that, the capacity to love, or the ability to see beauty in the world. Other faith systems have a very difficult time bringing clarity to that. They're walking in darkness. They don't know why that is. But the core tenets of Christianity say that because you were made in the image of God, you have the capacity to love, the capacity to see and even create beauty in the world, because God in his creative power said, let there be light. That's why you're able to create too, because you're made in his image. I want to read you a quote from C.S. Lewis that I think is absolutely brilliant, because this is what Jesus is saying when he says that you will not walk in darkness. Yes, it's spiritual darkness, but it's also seeing the way. It's like taking the blue pill in the Matrix, right? Or the red pill. I don't know which one it was, but you see through it. You see it for what it is. Listen to what Lewis says. He says, when I'm awake, I can in some degree account for and study my dream. The dragon that pursued me last night can be fitted into my waking world. I know that there are such things as dreams. I know that I had eaten an indigestible dinner. I know that a man of my reading might be expected to dream of dragons. But while in the night, more I could not have fitted in my waking experience. The waking world is judged more real because it can thus contain the dreaming world. The dreaming world is judged less real because it cannot contain the waking one. For the same reason, I am certain that in passing from the scientific point of view to the theological, I have passed from dream to waking. Did you hear it? I'll say it one more time. For the same reason, I am certain that in passing from the scientific point of view to the theological, I have passed from dream to waking. Christian theology can fit in science, art, morality, and the sub-Christian religions. The scientific point of view cannot fit in any of these things, not even science itself. Listen very, very closely. Here's our theme of light. I believe in Christianity as I believe the sun has risen, not only because I see it, but because by it I see everything else. I am the light of the world. Whoever follows me will not walk in darkness. Yes.
Is that from the book, Her Christianity?
No, it's from a lecture he gave at Oxford or Cambridge or Arizona State. I can't remember. If you look up C.S. Lewis quote about the sun, if you just Google that, it will render up for you where that's from. Okay. Here's the second promise Jesus makes. Not only, now I want you to look back at it. Look back at John 8, verse 12. Not only will that person not walk in darkness, but what is the second promise that he makes? It's really, really, really important. There's an operative word in there. He will what? Have the light of life. I think that's so important. That the follower of Jesus not only does not walk in darkness, but you are given the light of life. You possess the light of life. You have acquired the light of life. And because you have done so, you can thereby what? Share the light of life. These themes, like, it's funny. Again, I used her as an example quite a bit today, but as I was talking to her last night, she's like, once you see it, you can't unsee it. Because Jesus says, I am the light of the world, right? But what does he also say in the Sermon on the Mount? You are the light of the world. Remember? And the very next thing he says is what? A city on a hill cannot be hidden. Do you think he has Jerusalem in his mind? And the Feast of Booths? I can't be sure, but I would bet you my next paycheck. A city on a hill cannot be hidden. He says, anyone who follows after me has the light of life. You are the light of the world, Jesus says. So what that means, men of God, and then we'll wrap up here. What that means is that as someone who has made the choice, and in this life, we're never perfect, right? We're never finished apprenticing, discipling, following, right? But we've made the decision that on a day in, day out basis, we're going to systematically reorganize our life to reflect the character and priorities of Jesus. Sometimes it's 2 steps forward, 1 step back. Sometimes it's 2 steps forward, 927 steps back, right? Sometimes it's a challenge, sometimes it's rough. But as those who have made the choice to follow Jesus, who have now received from him salvation and been marked with a seal guaranteeing our inheritance of the Holy Spirit, now that we have been given the Holy Spirit as a guide, we now have the light of life, and we can go share the light of life with anyone and everyone around. I am the light of the world, Jesus says. Whoever follows me will not walk in darkness. He will have the light of life. We got through 1 verse with 2 minutes to spare. Let's pray. God, thanks for this morning. Thanks for these men. Thanks for your goodness to us. And though we spent the better part of an hour on this single verse, it still seems that there's yet so much ground to cover. Still seems to me that this is just the tip of the iceberg, perhaps not in intellectual understanding, but in deep life experience. God, it is a joy to see these faces nearly every week. And because I know of their faithfulness and sincerity and their deep love and for you and their desire to know you, I pray just an extraordinary blessing over their day. That they would walk and talk and live knowing that you are the light of the world. And because they follow you, they do not walk in darkness today. And they have the light of life to put in the hands of others as well. Thank you for your word and for your goodness to us. And together the men of God said, amen. Last thing I would encourage you to do a study in the Old Testament about light. We just scratched the surface. Okay. Go back and look in the Old Testament. Just look where light shows up and what that would have meant for the first century Hebrew mind. I won't be here next week, but I'll be here the week after.